Hello and welcome to the season finale of a podcast about murder. I'm Jem and I'm here with the magnificent Freya to discuss yet another case. How are you today?
I'm alright. Rocky start to the day, but I'm going to be enthralled and cheered up by chatting with you. That's my hope.
So today we'll be discussing a woman who has been labelled the most prolific female murderer, rumoured to have killed over 600 victims. This is also the oldest case we've ever discussed on this podcast.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Do you know what period this takes place in?
I thought it was...
I mean, we'll get into it, but...
I guess now that I think about it, it is probably the oldest. I mean, I'm imagining like it was the 16th century or something.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool.
Today we'll be delving into the life and crimes of Countess Erzsébet Báthory, and also known as the Blood Countess or Countess Dracula. As a warning to our listeners, we'll be discussing instances of torture and murder committed against young girls, so bear that in mind before we get started. Because this case is so old, a lot of the events have been warped or embellished over time, so keep that in mind as we go through these events. I've tried to be as factual as possible, and if I had any doubts concerning the veracity of any anecdotes, I either cut them out entirely or I will point them out as we discuss them.
There's a lot of myth and legend that came out of this case, so it is one of those ones where some of these things might just have not happened. But when something happened this long ago, you just have to take everything with a bit of a pinch of salt.
Yeah, exactly. On December 30th, 1610, magnate György Thurzó and his men stormed Teagray Castle with the intent of putting an end to Countess Bathory's reign of terror. Rumours of her torturing and murdering young girls had finally drawn the attention of the King of Hungary, who decided that something needed to be done. Thurzó and his party were unsure what they would find upon entering the castle. There were rumours that the Countess was involved in Satanism or witchcraft. According to some accounts, the party found at least 2 young female victims almost immediately. One was completely drained of blood, the other barely conscious. As they delved further into the castle, what they stumbled across was reportedly too monstrous to be written down. That night, Thurzó would arrest 5 people. Servants Dorottya Szemetes. No. This is going to be a rough one with all these like Hungarian names. I have no reference for what Hungarian should sound like. So
I've been there twice and I have no reference for what it sounds like. It's just one of those things.
Yeah. That night, Thurzó would arrest 5 people. Servants Dorottya Szemetes, Ilona Jo, Katerina Benica, János Uvari, and their mistress, Thurzó's old friend, Countess Erzsébet Báthory. Erzsébet Bathory was born on the 7th of August 1560 on her family's estate in Nyírbátor, Hungary. Her parents were Baron George IV and Baroness Anna Bathory. It is important to keep in mind throughout this story that this is an extremely wealthy and influential family at the time, almost of the same importance as the royal family. And in fact, Elizabeth's uncle, Stephen Bathory, was even the king of Poland, so that gives you some idea as to the importance and power that this family possesses.
Yeah. So when I said it was the 16th century,
you were like
bang on.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Just want to point that out.
Erzsébet spent her childhood at Ecsed Castle. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, so, just bear with me. Which is in eastern Hungary. Due to her incredibly privileged background, Erzsébet was a remarkably educated young woman who spoke multiple languages and had a mind for philosophy, science, and art. She was trained in mathematics and the classics, could read and write in Hungarian, Greek, Latin, German, and even Slovak, the language of her servants.
Wow. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah. She was interested in all sorts of subjects, such as religion, botany, astronomy, and biology. The extent of her education is actually quite impressive, and in the book Infamous Lady, The True Story of Countess Erzsébet Báthory, author Kimberley L. Craft points out that this kind of education was extremely rare for a young girl to receive.
Yeah.
Many speculate, however, that despite the many privileges she experienced growing up as part of the nobility, she bore witness to the dark side of aristocracy. Many offer these depictions of a violent and troubled childhood in order to explain the violence of her acts later in life. The Bathory family estate has even been described as, quote, an insane asylum filled with dysfunctional inbred lunatics.
Yeah. Sounds like many royal families.
Yeah. These scandalous rumours include a sex-crazed drunk for an uncle, a bisexual witch for an aunt who reportedly, quote, taught Erzsébet how to torture servants and make love to women.
Oh, okay.
And parents whose eccentricities bordered on insanity.
Right, okay. That's interesting.
It's obviously impossible to know to what extent these claims have any truth to them whatsoever, or are just the product of wild imagination. I personally don't find it hard to believe that members of the elite upper class who have absurd amounts of wealth and power would develop some pretty out there habits. But on the other hand, I also 100% believe that people would have just made up the craziest stories possible about them.
Yeah.
So it's just hard to tell with stories that are this old.
The last time that I heard about this case, I think I listened to a podcast about it. They mentioned how it was possible that because she had managed to amass such control over wealth and education in her own right, she was... that would make people more likely to sort of make stories up about her to make her look evil, because she was a woman who had a lot of influence and she had a lot of power and she was educated, and that was something that was quite frightening at the time. So that a lot of people would have maybe wanted to take her down a peg, if that makes sense.
No, exactly. She's quite a threatening figure for the time. And we will get into that a little more towards the end of this episode, I think, when we discuss various theories surrounding this case. One rumour I do find slightly more plausible is that Erzsébet was said to have witnessed the gruesome execution of a peasant as a child, which I think is not only possible, but definitely would have had a huge impact on her. At the time, servants were treated incredibly harshly, so I don't find it hard to believe that in her mind, from a very young age, she comes to see servants as almost less than human.
Dispensable.
In a sense. Yeah. Kimberley Craft explains that, discounting some of the crazier rumours surrounding the Bathory family, it is entirely possible that mental illness would have run in the family, mainly due to inbreeding. However, she also points out that some of the more violent eccentricities, such as temper tantrums or swordplay in the house, were just typical of the aristocracy.
Swordplay in the house. My God.
It is reported that Erzsébet suffered from seizures, possibly related to epilepsy, and that these seizures would have been treated by administering the blood of a non-epileptic person. Some believe that these treatments may have influenced the nature of her crimes in adult life, although it is hard to say to what extent any of that is true.
So they thought that if they just replaced your blood with the blood of someone that didn't have that illness, that it would cure you?
Yeah. In 1571, at the age of 11, Erzsébet was engaged to 16-year-old Ferenc Nadasdy de Nadasd et Fogarasfold, a young count.
Wow.
This engagement was, as you can imagine, more of a strategic political move arranged by the families than anything else. In December of the following year, Erzsébet was sent to live with her fiancé's family at Savar, where she would learn her new duties as the future wife of Ferenc Nadasdy. They married on the 8th of May 1575, and it is estimated that approximately 4,500 guests attended the wedding, just to give you some idea of the importance these families held. Erzsébet was 15 and her husband Ferenc, 19 at the time of their marriage. By the time of her wedding, both of Erzsébet's parents had died, leaving her with a considerable amount of wealth and property, as both her mother and her father had come from prestigious families. On top of this, the Bathory family was technically of a higher social standing than the Nadasdy family, so Erzsébet kept her maiden name, and her husband actually added the Bathory name to his long list of names. His wedding gift to her was the castle of Šejty, which is situated in the mountainous region in modern-day Slovakia. This castle also came with the 17 villages that surrounded it. This massive property, as well as the villages, and the Bathory family estates, became part of Erzsébet's primary responsibilities as the Countess of the region. She had to manage every aspect of life, including business affairs, political affairs, and tending to the local peoples that fell under her responsibility. When Ferenc's parents died, and they inherited their possessions, the couple had a combined inherited wealth that was absolutely staggering. They owned thousands of acres of land, dozens of towns, and more than 20 castles.
Wow. I'd like to have 20 castles.
Which is just insane. In 1578, Ferenc became the chief commander of the Hungarian troops during the many wars against the Ottoman Empire. This essentially meant that Erzsébet spent a lot of time by herself, managing every aspect of these many properties owned by the couple and tending to the locals that fell under her care. She is said to have ministered medical care to villagers, as well as come to the defense of women who had been raped or abused by Ottoman soldiers during the war. At this point in history, things such as military protection, hospitals, libraries, universities, and churches all fell under the responsibilities of nobles, such as Erzsébet and Ferenc. They were the ones who had to provide and maintain these institutions at their own cost. So, this far in the story, Erzsébet is very invested in the life of her, let's call them subjects, and she actually does a lot of work to promote quite a good life for them. By maintaining a lot of facilities for them. Which is interesting when contrasted to the horrific things she would do behind closed doors that we'll get into. Ferenc would frequently bring back riches from his many travels, and the couple continued to accumulate and generate wealth. It is said that they possessed more wealth than the King of Hungary himself. However, this wealth wasn't as reassuring as one might think, as it was all either tied up in property or luxurious exotic treasures, which weren't exactly easy to sell when times were tough. As such, although the family were in a position where they could loan money to the king himself, they were constantly worried about financial ruin. Over the course of their marriage, the couple had many children. It's hard to say exactly how many, as records seem to vary. Generally, people agree on the following children. Anna, born in 1585, Orsolia, born in 1590, Catalin, born in 1594, Andras, born in 1596, who died at the age of 7, and Pal, who was born in 1598. There were some records that indicated another son, Miklos, although this is hard to confirm. There were also rumours that a young Erzsébet had had an affair with a peasant boy at the age of 13, which resulted in a pregnancy. This alleged child was rumoured to have been given away to a local woman, although the rumours concerning this pregnancy seem to have cropped up many years after Erzsébet's death, so I don't put much stock in them. Overall, Erzsébet was perceived as a good wife and mother. However, there was a dark side to the Countess. She was a ruthless perfectionist and would reportedly not hesitate to dole out extreme corporal punishments on servants if things did not meet her standards. Although it is worth noting, as I was saying earlier, that such violence is sort of an element of typical everyday life at this period in history.
Yeah, it's not
to
it's
some
not
extent.
Like not to excuse it, but it's like that wouldn't have been considered.
It's not shocking in and of itself.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been considered unusual at the time, so by itself it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's horrible though to think about.
No, definitely. There are a lot of theories that suggest that while Erzsébet was a willful and demanding person in her own right, who was used to dominating others and getting what she wanted, her violent tendencies were encouraged and even fostered by her husband. As a war hero, he had lots of experience in the gruesome killing of enemy soldiers. These killings could often devolve into torture sessions that became more and more innovative and creative. It is hypothesized that Ferenc had introduced Erzsébet to the art of torture when she had come to live with him as a young teen. The couple allegedly performed horrific acts of torture upon their servants together, as Ferenc demonstrated techniques to his wife. On one of these such occasions, he apparently spread honey over a naked servant girl, leaving her to be stung by insects and bees on a hot day.
Ugh. What?
It's so weird.
I mean,
it's so... How do you get to that stage?
Does that happen? Like, do bugs come and sting what's got honey on it? I'm not sure.
Well, I'd imagine she would get bitten in any case.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be pleasant because it would attract insects. So you would be covered in insects. So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
It just kind of, it seems a bit theatrical.
Well, that's the thing. Is this story completely made up by some third party? We don't know.
I just don't know if it would work like that. But it is a horrible image, regardless.
Yeah. On another occasion, Ferenc demonstrated how to freeze a girl to death by forcing her to stay outside during a winter's day and gradually pouring water over her until she succumbed to death. Ferenc's experiences on the battlefield were also passed on to his wife. His behaviour on the battlefield was described as heinous at times. It is said that he danced with the bodies of dead soldiers on the battlefield and played kickball with their severed heads.
Oh, God.
Yeah. While Ferenc was away, Erzsébet would also write him letters, keeping him informed of her violent activities and potentially ritualistic or witchcrafty elements, which were hinted at in several letters between the two of them, where they would sort of exchange tips about black magic. And she would mention that someone had taught her a new kind of spell, and she was like informing him of this.
My face is stuck in a disgusted posture because of the kickball kicking the head. It's just such a horrendous image.
It's awful.
Again, as usual, I'm laughing, but I'm only laughing because it's ridiculous.
Among the exotic gifts Ferenc brought back from abroad was reportedly a sort of glove with sharp claws that could be worn to cut and stab victims. And he would have gifted this to Erzsébet, the implication being that it was sort of to help her in her general torture sessions. Anna Darvolia was a servant who worked for Erzsébet, who was extremely violent when it came to reprimanding other servants. She would advise Erzsébet on how to choose her victims and participated actively in the torture sessions with both Erzsébet and Ferenc. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there are these two influences in her life who actively participate in these torture sessions and encourage her to participate. And I point this out not to lessen the extent of her responsibility in these affairs, but just to say that the environment in which she is encourages her to act in a certain way.
Okay, yeah.
In her book, Kraft wonders what could have prompted Erzsébet to commit such acts of violence on her members of staff. She proposes that Erzsébet herself may have been a victim of abuse, both at the hands of her mother-in-law, who would have set about disciplining the young girl in order to train her for her duties as a wife, and at the hands of her husband, who wouldn't have hesitated to brutalize her behind closed doors, likely as a result from the severe trauma he would have suffered from the war.
I guess that's believable.
Well, it's also quite common, even in members of the upper class at this time, for women to be beaten. So it's not a stretch to imagine that he's violent with her. Kraft explains that Erzsébet's behaviour escalated over time. She would likely have started with pinching or biting, progressing to using pins to inflict harm upon fingers and lips, going on to inflict burns or cuts upon her victims. Kraft explains that, quote, when Erzsébet acted in concert with others, she found the courage to push the limits farther. She eventually learned how to torture in a serious way from her husband and Anna Darvolia. Erzsébet's victims were generally all unmarried adolescent girls, usually either members of staff or young girls from the surrounding villages. By the 1590s, people were aware that something strange was going on at the Nadasdy residences, but no one was sure enough to outright accuse the couple of anything. Young women started dying at Savar, which didn't in itself raise suspicions. What was strange, though, was that they were placed in sealed coffins before the pastor could arrive. The explanation...
Whoa. What you just said was before the pastor could arrive.
Like pastor, like the church officiant.
Don't you say pastor?
Pastor, yeah, okay.
I was like...
before they could make a lasagna.
They ordered pasta and before it could arrive.
That's like my expression. Before the pasta could even arrive. Before the pasta hit the colander. That's how quick it was. What was strange, though, was that they were placed in sealed coffins before the pastor could arrive. The explanation he was given was that there was a cholera outbreak that they wanted to prevent from spreading, but the reality was that they wanted to hide the extent of the girl's injuries.
Okay.
Ferenc was very concerned with his public image. As he was also the primary moneylender to the Hungarian crown and the Habsburg Empire, no one would actually dare accuse him or his wife of such acts of violence against their staff, and they were essentially allowed to get away with anything. Nonetheless, he did have a reputation to uphold, and murder would have tainted his image, so he maintained very strict rules and reprimanded Erzsébet for being reckless.
Yeah.
This meant that while Ferenc was alive, the number of murders was limited somewhat, so as not to draw suspicion. Ferenc Nadasdy died on the 4th of January 1604 from an unknown illness that had first began in 1601. As this illness had progressed, he had become gradually more physically disabled in the years leading up to his death. In his final days, he entrusted the care of his children and widow to his friend György Thurzó, who you'll recall from the beginning of this episode will come to be the man in charge of the investigation into Erzsébet's crimes. In the years following her husband's death, it seemed that nothing could hold back Erzsébet's bloodlust, and the deaths increased at an alarming rate. Rumours began to spread throughout Hungary as locals reported that funerals occurred at an alarming rate at Szarvas. The estate was heavily guarded, and everyone knew the rumours of the kind of deranged events that went on within its four walls. Following her husband's death, Erzsébet's finances became more and more precarious. While multiple kingdoms owed the Nadasdy's debts, none were willing to pay them off. To give you some idea of the scale of these debts, Kraft puts the figure at around $600,000 in modern-day currency. The stress caused by this financial pressure was intensified by the death of her brother, István Bathory, a year after Ferenc's death in 1605. According to witnesses, during the carriage ride to the funeral, she snapped and began viciously attacking the handmaids who were accompanying her. When asked to testify, servants at Szarvas would report that almost 200 victims had been murdered in the years following Ferenc's death alone. During these years, Erzsébet was aided by a small group of loyal sadistic servants. Anna Darvolia, Ilona Joe, Dorottya Semtej, Katalin Benica, and János Uvari. This group would torture and kill servant girls between the ages of 10 and 14.
God.
They had power over these girls due to their positions as senior members of the ladies' staff.
And on the virtue of them being 10 and 14.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think people often point out this sort of hierarchy because a lot of the people who are inflicting these horrific torture sessions are women as well.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily physical strength in this case, but it's also a sort of power imbalance. All agreed that Anna Darvolia had been the one to train them in the art of torture, just as she had taught Erzsébet herself. I do find this totally believable, but it is worth noting that Anna Darvolia would die before they were ever caught, and the group sort of seemed to agree on placing most of the blame on her, in a way.
Okay.
So she's an easy scapegoat for them. But then, you know, it's not like her dying stopped them from committing these atrocious acts. Obviously, the rumours surrounding the goings-on at Szarvas meant that eventually even offers of high wages weren't enough to lure new victims on site. Erzsébet's team of helpers had to extend their network further and further in their quest for new victims, and even began to engage a network of local residents to help them, including members of the nobility. So I find that interesting that there's maybe an implication that people are sort of aware of this, and just because she has so much power wouldn't question it.
Yeah. It's amazing the idea that they're like running out of people to torture.
Yeah.
And they're having to cast the net further and further to try and find new people to torture and kill because they've done so many. That's just mental.
Yeah, they've just burned through like so many people.
It's this sheer scale.
I can't even, Eventually, an idea was formed to establish a sort of finishing school for young aristocratic girls at Szarvas called the Gymnasium. This school was established in 1609 and initially worked fairly well, as rumours of Erzsébet's crimes obviously hadn't reached the upper classes of society, or they were intentionally turning a blind eye to them. Obviously, the flaw in this plan was that her victims were no longer anonymous members of the lower class. They were daughters of respected nobles, and at this stage, people noticed fairly quickly when their daughters started to go missing.
Bit of a stupid idea.
Yeah, but it just shows how, I mean, it's really become a sort of addiction.
It shows the audacity.
Yeah.
For sure.
I'm like, I can't, because she is, as we were discussing, she's quite an intelligent woman.
Yeah.
I don't know how she thought she would get away with that maneuver.
I think it's just the pure, like, I think there's a lot of serial killers to more modern times where you have a similar situation where they get so used to getting away with it that they think, wow, I'm never going to get caught, and then their activity becomes more and more sloppy and
it just becomes more and more audacious. Eventually, King Matthias II decided to intervene. Having heard the rumours and complaints of girls going missing or being killed in the region, he assigned György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, to investigate. And I think Palatine is basically, he's kind of like the Prime Minister.
Right.
Which is why he's the one who's assigned to this case.
Because I've also heard that word and I've always wondered, I mean, I feel like I've heard it in like Assassin's Creed or something.
Probably.
But I can't remember.
But he's just some high-ranking government official, let's say. In March 1610, Thurzó assigned 2 men to collect witness statements to prove these rumours, and by December, Thurzó decided to make his move against Erzsébet. On the night of the 12th of December 1610, Thurzó and his men infiltrated the castle. They stumbled across several injured or dead girls upon entering and arrested Erzsébet and her accomplices that very night. Thurzó conferred with Erzsébet's son, Pál, and 2 of her sons-in-law, Nicola VI Zrinski and György Drugeth. They decided to avoid a trial and execution in order to preserve the family name and, more importantly, keep Erzsébet's wealth and property in the family. The arrest resulted in 2 trials, one on the 2nd of January 1611, the second on the 7th of January 1611. While multiple witness accounts were used as evidence for upwards of 300 killings, there was very little written down to serve as proof of these testimonies. Many servants even, and I find this ironic and tragic, obviously, confessed to having witnessed these crimes under torture. So...
Oh my god. That is...
Yeah. It's such a weird logic.
That is definitely the most bizarre thing. I don't even know what to say to that.
I don't know. It's like, do they not perceive the wrongness of what they're doing?
I have to torture you to figure out if people have been tortured, because that would be wrong.
Yeah, very weird.
I mean...
Over the course of the trial, the numerous brutalities Erzsébet inflicted on her victims came to light. Descriptions of severe beatings that went on for days on end, mutilation, burning, freezing, and starving girls to death. There were even rumours of Erzsébet consuming her victims' flesh.
Oh my god.
Ultimately, her co-conspirators were executed for their crimes. While the king himself reportedly favoured her execution, her high social status made that complicated. Because I think basically if you're a noble at this time, you're exempt from the death penalty. And in order to put her to death for this, he would have to sort of go through a lengthy process of stripping her of her title, which may not be worth it in his mind.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Thurzó stated in Erzsébet's defence that she wasn't completely aware of the severity of her actions, although the court argued that she had clearly taken pleasure in the acts.
It's really hard to argue that someone could be, even at this time, that someone could be unaware that what they were doing was wrong.
At the same time as we were discussing, beating a servant is totally normal.
Yes.
So once that's normal, how do you know what's inappropriate?
Well,
I mean, obviously you should know.
I'll go with okay. I'm aware that I can beat my servants, but can I play football with their severed heads?
Yeah.
Can I peel like the skin off of them and stuff like that? I don't know. I just kind of feel like
no, I totally agree that she should be aware of this. I'm not saying that she isn't, but I'm trying to figure out what his logic is in this argument.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind these people also tortured people to get witness statements.
I know.
So I don't know.
It is amazing though that the clarity of it when it comes down to it, like when they go to arrest her and end this, they enter the place and then there's people's bodies in it and there are people who are injured inside it at that time. It's just there's no effort to...
That's what's interesting about that is that most of this information comes from Thurzó's accounts, and he doesn't actually provide a lot of detail. And there are speculations as to whether these details were made up, embellished. Is he trying to protect her, or is he making things up?
Right.
It's hard to know. And also this is the other thing, is that a lot of the servants who came forward to testify against her, saying that they had seen her beating servants, torturing them, etc., it was all sort of hearsay, because there were certain rooms in the castle that were forbidden to outsiders, so it's assumed that that's where she would carry out these torture sessions and would change clothes, so you would never see her covered in blood, and she would never do it in front of witnesses, which is obviously smart. And I believe that, that's probably how she would have gone about it. But it also makes you question, well, how do we know?
How do we know what really
she was
happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. And I guess there wouldn't have really been that much physical evidence. Unless...
That said, there were bones. Like, too many bones in the castle
I was just about to say, there's got to be some evidence of bodies.
Yeah.
Maybe not 300, but enough to kind of make it look like something definitely did happen.
Yeah. I would say so, and I think it's so hard to know because this is so long ago, but I have to assume there was some kind of physical evidence of these bodies. And then a lot of people argued that a lot of her servants who had survived were mutilated for life.
Just by having them to view, you could assume what kind of violence was being carried out there.
Yeah, and the fact that her co-conspirators confessed to these crimes as well.
Well, they were being tortured.
Well, that's the thing.
So I guess I don't know how much stock I place in those confessions, but what can you do?
So the court considered sending Erzsébet to a nunnery, which I find so funny because that's the solution for every woman problem in the past is like, well, let's just send her to the nunnery, guys.
That'll sort her out. Everything will be fine after that.
It was ultimately decided that she would be confined to Teagray Castle. There were conflicting accounts of this confinement. Some accounts state that she was walled up in a sealed room that had very small openings to allow for air and food, while others give the impression that she was more or less free to roam the castle but not allowed to leave the grounds. Interestingly, throughout the trial, and presumably for the remainder of her life, Erzsébet claimed she was innocent and that the girls had died of various other ailments.
Well, that's what I was going to bring up actually a moment ago when we were talking about bones being found on the castle.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm assuming there's no super sophisticated way to dispense of people who've died of natural causes, which at this time I assume is quite common, especially if you're a servant living in, one can only assume, not great conditions.
Yeah.
And you don't have access to healthcare, and you don't have access to the best, to the nicest things.
On the flip side of these accounts, she was someone who was very invested in her servants' well-being.
Yeah,
at times.
I'm just thinking in the 1500s, 1600s, I don't think it's out of the question that several people would die of something natural while working there.
No, definitely. That's the thing, like the whole cholera coffin thing. I could see that both ways, where it's like, well, this is deeply suspicious. Cholera, you say? And on the other hand, just being like, yeah,
cholera.
It's fucking cholera. Like, why are you being so weird about this?
Yeah.
In 1614, Erzsébet finalised the specificities of her will, arranging for all of her possessions to be distributed among her children. On the evening of August 20th, 1614, Erzsébet reportedly complained of cold hands to one of the guards. The guard dismissed these concerns and told her to go lie down. She was found dead in her room the following morning. She died at the age of 54. Though initially buried by the church in Teagray, locals complained about her being buried there, and she was eventually moved to her family home in Exeter. The whereabouts of her body today are unknown. So, I guess it's not really a mystery because it happened so long ago. It's like you can lose track of bones.
Yeah.
And it could happen to anyone. So there are a few theories surrounding her motivations for these crimes that I think we'll briefly discuss. So one theory is that she suffered from some kind of illness, as we were discussing at the beginning of this episode, perhaps epilepsy or something similar, and she was trying to treat it through blood medicine or blood magic. The only reason I don't believe that is that if you think that she's committed these crimes, there's so much unnecessary suffering inflicted.
Yeah.
That it's just not practical. If it were literally just like, I believe that I need other people's blood to cure myself, there's no need to beat them to death.
There's certainly no need to carry out extended periods of torture, freezing, burning, starving. Yeah. So yeah, I would agree with that.
The second theory, which is obviously one of the most popular theories, is that she was a some kind of vampire or witch who either consumed the blood and flesh of her victims or would bathe in the blood of her victims to maintain her youth and beauty, because she was said to be quite vain and concerned with her appearance.
And that's the classic story about her. The bathing in the blood thing.
That is the classic story about her. However, I did read somewhere that this rumour arose around 200 years after her death. So that's interesting to bear in mind, that it's not even a contemporary account of her necessarily. Okay. Although I do think there were rumours of her being a witch or Satanist. And I think it's not unlikely that she's got a mind for science and she would be sort of doing these kind of experimental things. And combined with these incredibly violent acts, you would just sort of put two and two together and think she's a witch.
Yeah.
So while the rumours of her bathing in blood, I don't think came about while she was alive, rumours of her being a witch or a Satanist definitely were going around at the time of her life. And the final theory I'd like to discuss is that the whole thing is a conspiracy.
Oh, okay.
Which I find interesting. So basically, this theory assumes that the whole thing was made up because, as you were saying at the beginning of this episode, she had too much wealth and power and was sort of too smart for her own good. And the Hungarian and Habsburg monarchies didn't like this. And they were indebted to her as well.
Oh, yeah.
So they basically invented this story to strip her of her wealth and status. Which I think is interesting. However, people who criticize this theory will point out that for this to be true, over 300 witness accounts would have had to have been made up or faked.
Yeah, I like the theory because I think it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. And I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that you would torture enough people to make this story work, because at the time nobody cares about stuff like that, so you can just get whatever story you want from anyone by torturing.
Also the only history is written by the winners, as they say, or whatever the expression is. So it's whoever's in power is going to write the official version of events,
exactly,
and they can decide whatever that is.
Especially at this time where we don't have the same record keeping, the same levels of recording physical evidence, recording things like that. So I can see it. On the other hand, I'm like, no smoke without fire.
Yeah. And it seems like such a weird thing to make up completely, where I'm sure you could come up with something that was less extreme and get rid of her.
I feel like it could be both. I think it could be the case where she did do these things and these things are true, but maybe they're exaggerated by the people in power who wanted her out of power, as it were. And maybe they exaggerated the things to really tear down her off her pedestal or whatever. And maybe some of the accounts are false, but they're about a real thing. But the accounts are just there to sort of bolster the story.
I could see that. That seems like the most realistic explanation to me, that there's a bit of both. So that's that for the case of Erzsébet Báthory.
Interestingly, I think a lot of people would know her name as Elizabeth.
Yeah, I've been probably butchering the Hungarian variant of her name.
I thought about bringing that up at the beginning, and then I thought, no, I'll leave it until the end for some reason. But I did find that surprised me.
Well, I think because it was in the book that I was reading about her, she is consistently referred to by her actual name instead of the anglicized version of her name.
Yeah.
And I just thought I'd stick with that.
No, I think it's good to use her actual name, but it's interesting because most people will know her as Elizabeth Bathory, but I don't even think the last part is accurately how you would say it.
I have no idea how. I probably mispronounced her name for this whole episode, so I apologize for that. No, it's probably something like Bathory or something. That makes me sound like Count Dracula.
I feel like there's not going to be a th sound. It's probably going to be Bathory or something.
Yeah, well, Georgi Thurzo is how you write his name, and I've sort of been going for a Thurzo.
Yeah, I feel like it's
accurate.
probably Terzo or something like that. I don't know. I don't hear a lot of... I can't believe I was about to say I don't hear a lot of th in Hungarian, but it's like, how often do I hear Hungarian? I don't know. So, yeah.
So for this episode, I have been reading, and I haven't finished it yet because it's quite a detailed book that really gives a lot of information on the historical situation surrounding these crimes.
Yeah.
But it's entitled Infamous Lady, The True Story of Countess Erzsébet Báthory by Kimberley L. Croft. So go check that out if you're interested in this case.
Cool.
Other than that, we thank you for listening and we hope you enjoyed this episode. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel on whatever platform you listen to these. We are also on social media. If you'd like to connect with us there, we'd love to hear from you. On Twitter at About Murder, on Instagram at A Podcast About Murder. On Facebook, it's A Podcast About Murder with no E. You can always send us an email at apodcastaboutmurder@outlook.com. And we're also on YouTube if you want to search for us there.
Yeah. I really like, for example, on our last episode, getting to chat with people who have different theories about what happened in a certain case and hearing what people think about what could have happened. And they might disagree, but it's always like they might disagree with my theory or I might disagree with their theory, but it's just really interesting to have that discussion. So definitely come on down to whatever comment section you find and do that. So I don't know when, I mean, we're planning on doing an extra episode.
Yeah.
But after that, we're not sure, to be honest, what's going to happen.
Things are
going to be a bit up in the
getting
air.
a bit, in our respective personal lives, I think things are getting a bit complicated. Not in a bad way.
That really sounds like we've committed a crime when we're going on the run or something like that.
We're both going to be quite busy with different projects and we're not sure when we'll be able to return to the podcast, but hopefully it won't be too long.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be a crazy length of time compared to the other lengths of time that we've left. So please stick with us and bear in mind that we'll be back when we'll be back. But thanks. Thanks so much for joining us for all these episodes. It's fun.
Alrighty. Have a good weekend.
Oh, it's about...
I cut you off.
Have a great weekend.
All right. I'm stopping now.